12,000 years of conquest had given the Xylos Empire a particular quality of attention, or rather, a particular quality of inattention. When you have absorbed 400 star systems, when your military has never encountered a problem it could not solve through superior numbers or superior technology, you develop a kind of comfortable blindness to things that do not immediately threaten you. New species were logged, assessed, and categorized with the same bureaucratic efficiency applied to everything else. Most were offered protectorate status. A few were erased. None had ever surprised the War Council. The species on the blue-green planet at the edge of known space barely warranted a full session. The council chairman, an ancient being named Vorth, reviewed the summary data while other matters were still being cleared from the agenda. Faster-than-light capability achieved 80 years ago. Ships small and lightly armed. Political structure fragmented across dozens of competing governments. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and said what everyone in the room was already thinking. Another insect crawling from the mud. He ordered a scout fleet sent to observe, with instructions not to engage. If the species proved manageable, protectorate status. If not, erasure. The council moved on before anyone had finished noting it in the record. Only one person in the room did not move on. Saren was the most junior advisor present, young enough that her opinion was rarely requested and rarely given. But she had done something the council had not. She had read the full report. Earth's gravity exceeded galactic standard by a significant margin. Its atmosphere ran thick with reactive oxygen that would damage unprotected tissue in minutes. And the classification assigned to the planet by the Xenobiological Survey Team sat at the bottom of the file, unremarked upon, filed as a routine detail. Deathworld Level 12. In all the records the Xylos Empire had accumulated across 12,000 years of expansion, no species had ever emerged from a world rated above Level 6. Saren sat very still and said nothing, which was all she was permitted to do. Vorth granted Saren's research, request the way you grant a child permission to play, without interest in the outcome, certain it would produce nothing worth remembering. She had one condition attached: do not waste resources. She agreed and went to work. The human databases took time to translate, not because the languages were complex, but because there were so many of them. Dozens of distinct tongues, each with its own structure, and underneath all of them a history that went back 10,000 years without pause. Saren had expected the history of a young species, tentative, localized, gradually expanding outward. What she found instead was something that kept her at her console long past the end of her scheduled shift. The humans had spent most of their recorded history fighting each other. Not in the ritualized, bounded conflicts that most species use to settle territorial disputes, but in total wars, conflicts that consumed entire continents, that redirected the full productive capacity of civilizations toward the single goal of destroying other civilizations. They had developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet multiple times over. And then, at the precise moment when using those weapons became possible, they had stopped. Not because the weapons were taken away. Not because some external force intervened. They had simply chosen, collectively and without any coordinating authority, not to cross that particular line. Saren found this more unsettling than the wars themselves. The biological data was equally difficult to process. Human bodies could sustain physical effort for hours or days without rest, wearing down prey through sheer persistence rather than speed. Their healing capacity sat well outside galactic norms. Their documented range of survivable environments, Arctic, desert, high altitude, high pressure, spanned conditions that would incapacitate most species within minutes. She compiled everything into a report and submitted it to the War Council. Someone read the first page. She received a filing confirmation 2 days later. Low priority. She sat at her desk afterward and said quietly to no one in particular that they did not understand what they were reading and that they were going to die. The war with the Gornak hegemony was supposed to be straightforward. The Gornak were smaller than the Xylos in almost every measurable way, but they knew their own territory intimately and had spent decades preparing defensive positions along their most likely approach vectors. The War Council projected 6 weeks to resolution, possibly 8 if the Gornak proved more stubborn than anticipated. It was a minor conflict. It would be handled. The decision to conscript auxiliary forces was made less out of necessity than out of administrative habit. Protectorate species were expected to contribute during imperial conflicts, and the war provided a convenient opportunity to evaluate which of the newer additions might be worth developing further. Someone pulled up the list of recent acquisitions and found the humans near the bottom, flagged for low priority review. Vorth barely glanced at the entry before issuing the request. 20 ships. Cargo haulers. Let them carry supplies or move equipment. Something useful but undemanding. The human response arrived within a single day, which was faster than most protectorate species managed. It was polite and brief, and contained one request that made Vorth read it twice. They did not ask for weapons or reinforcements or any adjustment to their assignment. They asked only for coordinates, specifically, the locations of the Gornak forward supply depots. Not military installations. Not defensive positions. Supply lines. He found it amusing enough to share with the room. 20 cargo haulers wanted to raid supply depots. The council appreciated the joke. He sent the coordinates and forgot about it before the end of the session. The human fleet departed without ceremony, without announcement, without any of the formal declarations that most species use to mark the beginning of military operations. They simply left. For 3 weeks, no one in the War Council thought about them at all. Then the first report arrived, and it noted that the entire Gornak forward scout fleet had ceased transmitting. Vorth assumed a technical fault somewhere in the relay network. It was a reasonable assumption. It was completely wrong. 6 hours after the first report, the second one landed on Vorth's desk. The Gornak secondary fleet, 40 warships, a substantial force by any reasonable standard, had also gone silent. No distress signals had been recorded. No debris had been detected drifting through the area they had last occupied. No escape pods. No survivors. No evidence that anything had happened at all except the simple, clean absence of 40 ships that had been there and were no longer. Vorth ordered a reconnaissance vessel to investigate rather than drawing conclusions from reports. The vessel jumped to the Gornak supply sector, ran a full sensor sweep, and found exactly what the reports had described. Empty space. The kind of emptiness that is notable precisely because something should be filling it. The only anomaly the sensors detected was faint, heat trails, residual engine signatures, leading away from the sector in the direction of human space. The trails were old enough to be nearly invisible. The vessel's captain noted them in the log and flagged them as possibly relevant. Vorth did not find them relevant. He found them interesting in the way you find a coincidence interesting before dismissing it. 20 cargo haulers could not account for 40 warships. The mathematics were too absurd to take seriously. He said so in the morning briefing, and most of the council agreed with him. Saren did not agree. She had been sitting on her research for weeks, waiting for an opening that would not be dismissed immediately, and she used the one she had. She explained the concept she had found in human military archives, asymmetric warfare, the practice of defeating a larger force not by matching its strength, but by finding and eliminating the single point it had failed to protect. Vorth silenced her with a look and moved on. Humans were primitive. Their sensors would have detected anything capable of taking 40 warships. The discussion was closed. The following morning, the main Gornak armada stopped transmitting. All 200 ships, simultaneously, without warning. The War Council sat around the briefing table, and for the first time in 12,000 years of unbroken conquest, nobody laughed. The war ended on the 9th day, and it ended in a way the Xylos War Council had no existing category for. The Gornak hegemony sent a surrender transmission, which was expected. What was not expected was the contents of it. The message was addressed to the Xylos Empire, but it was not surrendering to the Xylos Empire. It was surrendering to something else, to the ones in the dark, the message said, the ones who had been taking their ships. The Gornak ambassador, who delivered it in person, seemed less like a defeated military commander, and more like someone who had recently experienced something they were still trying to process. Vorth pressed for specifics. The ambassador provided very few. The ships had been taken without warning, without visible attackers, without any engagement that followed recognizable patterns of combat. The crews who had managed to escape before their vessels were neutralized described small, fast craft that appeared from unexpected directions and vanished before any targeting solution could be established. And they did not stop. The ambassador said this phrase several times, in the manner of someone returning to the only description that felt accurate. Whatever had come for the Gornak supply network had continued coming regardless of what was put in its way. It had not been deterred. It had not paused. It had simply continued until there was nothing left to continue against. For the first time in 12,000 years of recorded Xylos history, Vorth granted Saren's request without a dismissive wave. She spent 3 days with the Gornak survivors and returned with a report that she placed on the council table without commentary. The humans had never engaged a single military target. Every action had been directed at fuel storage, communication relays, and food supply infrastructure. The Gornak fleet had not been defeated in battle. It had been left intact and completely unable to function, and had eventually ceased to exist as a fighting force because a fighting force needs to eat and move and communicate, and none of those things had remained possible. The council read the report in full this time. The room was very quiet afterward. The debate that followed lasted several weeks and covered essentially 3 positions. The first was immediate military action, send a force large enough to eliminate the human threat before it could develop further. The second was diplomatic absorption, offer humanity a formal protectorate arrangement with more favorable terms than usual, bring them inside the imperial structure where they could be monitored and managed. The third position, which Saren advanced carefully and with full awareness of how it would be received, was permanent non-engagement. Leave human space entirely alone. Draw a boundary and never cross it. Accept that this particular corner of the galaxy was not worth the cost of finding out what it would take to control it. Vorth listened to all 3 positions with the patience of someone who had already made up his mind. When the discussion reached its natural end, he spoke with the calm certainty of a being who had commanded an empire for longer than most civilizations had existed. The Xylos did not negotiate with protectorate species. They did not retreat from territory they had identified as relevant to imperial interests. They assembled force proportional to the problem and applied it until the problem resolved. This was how 12,000 years of unbroken expansion had been achieved, and it was not a method he intended to abandon because 20 cargo haulers had disrupted a supply network. 100,000 ships, the largest armada the Empire had ever assembled. Vorth announced it as though the scale itself was the answer, as though no question remained that this number could not resolve. Saren stood before she had permission to speak. Her voice was steady enough, though her hands were not. She told him he had not read the full report. She told him that the humans had not survived their home world through luck or technology, or any advantage that could be quantified and countered. They had survived because survival was the thing they had been doing every single day for as long as they had existed, and they were extraordinarily good at it. And they did not experience large numbers as frightening in the way that other species did because large numbers had always been trying to kill them and had always failed. Vorth had her removed from the chamber before she finished the sentence. The armada was assembled over the following months, vast, immaculate, and already lost, though no one standing in its shadow understood that yet. The armada arrived at the coordinates of the human home system in perfect formation, 100,000 warships arranged into an attack configuration that had ended every previous conflict it had been deployed in before a single shot was fired. The psychological effect of that much military hardware occupying a region of space was, in normal circumstances, sufficient to produce immediate surrender from anything with the self-awareness to understand what it was looking at. Vorth had used this formation 11 times in his career. It had worked 11 times. The sensors swept the system and found it largely quiet. No defensive fleet waiting at the jump point. No fortifications arranged along the likely approach vectors. No communication traffic that suggested emergency mobilization. Only one ship, small and unremarkable, positioned in the open between the armada and the planet, broadcasting on all available frequencies in a loop that every Xylos vessel received simultaneously. Turn back. This is your only warning. Vorth looked at the vessel for a moment on the main display, then laughed, the last time he would ever make that sound, and ordered it destroyed. The weapons fired. The ship vanished before impact, cleanly and completely, as though it had simply chosen to stop being in that location. And in the same instant, across every one of the 100,000 ships arranged behind him, every power system went dark. Not weapons selectively. Not shields as a warning. Everything. Engines stopped mid-cycle. Life support dropped to emergency reserves. The communication array produced nothing but static. 100,000 warships became 100,000 drifting objects, each one sealed and silent, and entirely at the mercy of whatever had just decided to demonstrate what mercy looked like. Then the small human vessel reappeared in exactly the position it had occupied before, as though it had simply stepped aside to allow something to pass and had now stepped back. The message resumed from the beginning. Turn back. This is your only warning. Vorth ordered a second volley with weapons that no longer had power to fire, and the same thing happened again, and the message continued at the same unhurried pace it had maintained from the start. The order to retreat came from Vorth before the second power restoration had fully completed, which was the fastest he had ever issued any command in his career, and the first retreat order he had given in 12,000 years of service to the Empire. The engines did not respond. The navigation systems returned no output. Every ship in the Armada sat exactly where it had been when the power left, and sat there still, and the silence between vessels was the kind that accumulates when 100,000 crews have all arrived at the same understanding simultaneously and have nothing useful to say about it. The human vessel transmitted again after a pause that felt deliberate, as though someone on the other end had waited long enough for the situation to be fully absorbed before adding to it. The message offered 3 hours. One vessel, retaining whatever emergency power remained, could return to the Empire carrying a message of the crew's choosing. After 3 hours, any ships remaining in human space would be considered hostile and treated accordingly. The word accordingly was not elaborated on. It did not need to be. Vorth found a scout ship running on backup power near the edge of the formation and had it prepared for departure. He recorded his message himself, without assistance, speaking into the relay with the deliberateness of someone who understood they were producing the most important document of their civilization's history. He said not to send reinforcements. He said not to approach human space under any circumstances. He said the weapons they had encountered were beyond anything in the Imperial Registry, that the humans were not what the surveys had described, that the word primitive did not apply and had never applied, and he wished someone had listened when that had been said by someone who had done the reading. The scout ship moved toward the jump point at the best speed its failing systems could manage. 3 hours passed in the way that hours pass when everyone present is waiting for something and no one wants it to arrive. When the human vessel transmitted again, the message was short. It said that the Armada had chosen not to leave, and that this choice was respected. Then every ship vanished. 100,000 vessels, their crews, their weapons, their 12,000 years of accumulated Imperial confidence, gone between one moment and the next, leaving nothing behind. No wreckage drifted through the space they had occupied. No signals faded on any frequency. Only the scout ship remained, limping toward the jump point, carrying a warning that the Empire would spend the rest of its existence trying to decide what to do with. The scout ship docked at the homeworld's military port in the early hours of the morning, and by the time the sun had fully risen the War Council was assembled and Vortha's recording was playing through the chamber's speakers for the first time. The room was silent in a way that rooms are silent when the people in them are each separately trying to accommodate something that will not fit inside their existing understanding of how the world works. When the recording finished, someone asked for it to be played again. Then again after that, the words that kept returning, that seemed to occupy the air of the chamber long after the audio had stopped, were the last ones. There's something else entirely. Saren had been escorted from the building the day her removal was ordered, and had not been back since. A formal summons reached her before the third replay had finished. She arrived to find the full council present, and watching her with the particular expression of people who have recently discovered they were wrong about something important, and are not yet certain how to arrange their faces around it. She did not offer comfort. She stood at the front of the chamber and explained what she had tried to explain before, more slowly this time, because now there was reason to believe they would listen. Earth's gravity had shaped every system in the human body across millions of years of adaptation. The atmosphere was oxygen-rich and reactive, and had produced a metabolism that ran harder and recovered faster than anything the galactic standard had developed. The radiation from their sun was not shielded to the degree most inhabited worlds provided, and so the humans had built repair mechanisms into their biology that other species had simply never needed. They had no claws, no natural armor, no venom. The planet had not given them weapons. It had given them something that could not be removed or countered or outranged. The will to continue regardless of what continuing cost. They had given the Armada a warning. One ship. One message. The Armada had fired on it and found out what happened next. The Council asked what they should do now. Saren looked at them for a moment before answering. One word. Nothing. The Council sat with the word for approximately 2 days before rejecting it. The arguments against doing nothing were familiar and deeply felt. The Empire's reputation across 400 systems, the precedent that withdrawal would set, the practical question of what it communicated to every other species, watching to see how the Xylos responded to a setback of this scale. Pride was mentioned frequently, and not always as a criticism. Pride was, in a certain reading, the mechanism by which 12,000 years of expansion had been sustained. You did not build what the Xylos had built by absorbing losses and moving on quietly. 200,000 ships this time. The decision was made with the confidence of people who believed that the first failure had been a matter of insufficient force rather than a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were dealing with. Saren made her case one more time, standing at the same position she had occupied during her previous attempt, using different words in the hope that different words might produce a different result. The humans had not won through superior technology, she said. If they had, reverse engineering the technology would be a reasonable response. What they had demonstrated instead was a way of operating, patient, indirect, targeting the systems that made large forces functional rather than the forces themselves. You could not study a captured piece of hardware and learn to think the way they thought. Behavior was not a weapon you could take apart and reassemble on your own side. The council thanked her for her perspective and proceeded with the assembly. The second armada jumped to the coordinates where the first had vanished and found empty space, which the commander interpreted as confirmation that the previous engagement had depleted whatever the humans had used. 6 hours of cautious advance produced nothing, no contacts, no signals, no sign of any presence at all. Then the sensors updated, and the update was not what anyone had been watching for. The human ships were not ahead of them. They were behind them, positioned with a precision that suggested they had been moving into place during the entire 6 hours of silence, and the route back to the jump point was no longer clear. Admiral Xylos gave the attack order immediately, which was the correct response to a force positioned behind you and the wrong response to this particular force. The human ships did not hold position and exchange fire. They moved in a way that the Xylos sensor systems struggled to follow, not because they were fast in any conventional sense, but because they produced almost none of the signatures that tracking systems were calibrated to detect. No engine exhaust, no heat bloom, no electromagnetic output from weapons charging. They drifted between positions as though the space between them were simply a suggestion, and every Xylos vessel that established a targeting solution found its power gone before the solution could be used. The darkness spread through the armada in clusters. 50 ships at a time, then 100, then entire sections going silent simultaneously as the human vessels moved through the formation with the unhurried efficiency of something that had done this before and saw no reason to rush. Xylos watched the display updating in real time and found himself thinking of a word he had encountered in a xenobiology briefing long ago, in a context he had considered purely academic. The briefing had described certain predator species on high-gravity worlds that did not chase prey, but simply moved through a territory, neutralizing everything present, not from aggression but from a kind of thoroughgoing methodicalness. The word the briefing had used was harvesting. A message arrived on his console from the human fleet, plain text, no encryption, as though the content required no protection because the situation made protection irrelevant. It said the armada had come back after being asked not to, and that the ships would now be kept. The crews would be returned to the home world. The ships would not be returned. Xylos attempted to order a full retreat, and felt his own vessel's power leave in the middle of the sentence. The bridge went dark around him. When the emergency lighting engaged a few seconds later, the boarding party was already through the airlock, small figures and equipment that looked practical rather than militaristic, moving through his command center with calm, systematic attention, their expressions suggesting not hostility, but the focused interest of people who had arrived somewhere they had been curious about for some time. The escape pods began arriving at the home world 3 weeks after the second armada had jumped out and not returned. They came in groups, scattered across a 20-hour window, each one carrying a small number of crew members who were dehydrated and disoriented, but otherwise unharmed. The medical teams processing them noted the same physical condition across every pod, adequately fed, wounds treated, no signs of mistreatment. The psychological assessments took longer and produced stranger results. Every survivor described the same experience in different words. The humans had provided food and water and attended to injuries without being asked. They had moved through the captured ships with complete confidence and no apparent concern about the thousands of Xylos crew members watching them work. And they had asked questions, not tactical questions, not intelligence gathering of the kind that made strategic sense, but questions about Xylos' history, about cultural practices, about what kinds of music the Empire produced, and whether the architectural styles varied between home world and colony. They seemed, the survivors said with varying degrees of bewilderment, genuinely interested in the answers. Xylos was among the last to be released. A human had spoken with him before his pod was dispatched, and he had committed the conversation to memory with the care of someone who understood it would be the most important thing he ever reported. The message was simple. The humans had no interest in the Xylos Empire. They had no territorial ambitions, no desire for resources or tribute or acknowledgement of superiority. They wanted to be left alone, and they had now demonstrated twice what being left alone looked like from their end. If a third armada came, the crews would not be returned. They would be kept, and they would be asked questions at length, and the Council should consider carefully what answers those crew members might eventually provide about Xylos' military infrastructure, strategic thinking, and defensive vulnerabilities. The Council declared human space permanently off-limits before the last escape pod had finished docking. Saren's promotion to Chief Advisor was formalized the same afternoon, and her first official act was to submit a classification order covering every piece of human-related data in the Imperial Archives. She explained her reasoning to the one council member who asked. If other species knew the humans existed and knew what they were capable of, those species would eventually test the borders themselves, which would produce outcomes the Xylos were no longer in a position to manage or predict. Better to let the story become something people told quietly and were not entirely sure was true. Better to let them be a myth. It was, she said, considerably safer that way. The decades that followed the Second Armada's disappearance did not restore what had been lost so much as reveal how much had been built on the assumption that loss was not possible. 300,000 ships gone, along with the experienced crews that had operated them, the institutional knowledge those crews carried, and the unspoken confidence that had allowed the Xylos Empire to move through the galaxy as though it owned the concept of force itself. What remained was functional but diminished, like a structure still standing after the load-bearing elements have been quietly removed. Other species noticed. They had been watching, as species do when a dominant power absorbs a shock it cannot explain, and the watching had produced its own conclusions. Border incidents that would previously have been resolved with a single fleet deployment now required negotiation. Territorial concessions that would once have been unthinkable became the available options. The Xylos retreated, and each retreat was managed and framed and presented as a strategic adjustment, but everyone involved understood what it was. Saren kept a small office in the Imperial Palace, which was more than she had expected and less than she deserved. She was old enough now that the databases she had translated 40 years ago had the quality of old correspondence, familiar, a little faded, carrying the specific warmth of things revisited rather than discovered. She had learned 2 human languages properly, past the point of translation, and into the place where you begin to understand how a language shapes the thinking of the people who grew up inside it. She had developed an appreciation for human music that she had never bothered to explain to anyone because she was not sure she could. It was loud in ways that felt intentional and chaotic in ways that resolved into something coherent if you stayed with it long enough. She found it comforting late at night when the palace was quiet. The young officer who knocked on her door that evening was apologetic about the hour. He had a message, he said, from the edge of human space, addressed specifically to her, by name, through channels that should not have known her name at all. Saren set down the document she had been reading and felt something she had not felt in 40 years move through her chest like a change in air pressure before weather arrives. She played the message alone, which felt right. The voice was human. She recognized the cadence from decades of study, the particular rhythm of a language that had evolved to carry a great deal of information in a small number of words. It was calm and warm and carried the specific quality of someone speaking to a person they have been watching long enough to feel they know. The message knew things it should not have known. It knew about the council sessions she had spoken in and been removed from. It knew the titles of the reports she had submitted and the classification codes assigned to them afterward. It knew that she had kept studying after everyone else had stopped, that she had continued reading human history and listening to human music in a small office in a declining empire, while the galaxy slowly rearranged itself around the space where Xylos' certainty used to be. They had been watching, the voice said, for 40 years, carefully and continuously, and they had decided that she, alone among her species, was worth the conversation they were now proposing. What followed was not a threat and not a demand. The Empire's situation was described accurately and without apparent satisfaction. The border pressures, the military constraints, the compounding difficulties of maintaining 400 systems without the force that had originally made maintaining them possible. The humans could help with this, not as conquerors taking advantage of a weakened position, and not as protectors extracting tribute for services rendered, but as allies in the full sense of the word, with interests that did not require the Xylos to diminish in order to be served. In exchange they wanted one thing, the voice said, a formal acknowledgement of their existence at the galactic level, a seat at the table where the species of the galaxy conducted the business of coexisting. They had been in the dark long enough. It was time to be seen. The message ended. Saren sat in her chair for a long time with the specific stillness of someone whose mind is moving very quickly through implications. Then she smiled, which was not an expression anyone who knew her would have expected in that moment, and began composing her reply. The most dangerous alliance in galactic history was about to begin, and she was going to accept it with both hands. The announcement produced exactly the range of responses Saren had predicted and prepared for. Confusion arrived first, followed closely by fear, followed by the various theories that fear generates when it needs somewhere to go. The most common assumption was conquest, that the Xylos had not allied with humanity but surrendered to it, that the formal language of partnership was a face-saving arrangement over a fait accompli that had already been decided. Others read it as an elaborate deception, though what the deception was intended to achieve remained unclear across many discussions. A small number of species who had inherited fragments of the old rumors about what lived at the edge of known space simply updated their private assessments and said nothing publicly, which was its own kind of response. The first human ambassador arrived without announcement, which was itself a statement. No advance fleet. No diplomatic convoy. A single small vessel, unarmed in a way that the sensor sweeps confirmed rather than merely claimed, requesting docking clearance through standard channels in perfectly formal Xylos. Her name was Alara. She was shorter than Saren had expected, though she was not sure why she had formed an expectation. The gray uniform she wore had no insignia, no indication of rank, nothing that would tell you what this person was in relation to the civilization behind her. She had the calm attentiveness of someone who had been in many rooms and found all of them interesting. They sat in Saren's office because Saren had suggested it, and because Alara had agreed without the hesitation that a more politically minded diplomat might have shown about the symbolism of location. The tea was already prepared, a blend Saren had spent some years learning to produce correctly from dried materials acquired through channels she had never fully explained to anyone. Alara drank it with the genuine appreciation of someone encountering something familiar in an unexpected place. She spoke first, which Saren had also expected. She said that Saren had saved her species today, not through weapons or strategy, but through the simpler and rarer act of continuing to be right about something in an environment that kept punishing her for it. They respected that, she said, which Saren understood to mean that she had been observed doing it and the observation had mattered. Then Saren asked the question she had been carrying for 40 years. The answer arrived with a smile and no hesitation at all. The ships had disabled themselves. The humans had simply taught them how. The explanation was not what Saren had spent 40 years imagining. She had constructed many theories across those decades, exotic energy weapons, some manipulation of the laws governing how matter occupied space, a technology so advanced it had no analog in anything the Xylos had developed. The actual answer was quieter than any of those, and it sat in her chest with the specific weight of something that is obvious once stated and completely invisible until then. Every Xylos warship carried a quantum power regulation core, a piece of standard engineering so fundamental to the vessel's operation that it predated most of the weapons systems built around it. The core was designed with a fail-safe, a specific energy signature, generated by diagnostic equipment, that would trigger a controlled shutdown if detected during testing. The signature had been documented in technical specifications published across the Empire's engineering infrastructure for decades, accessible to anyone with the clearance to request them and, as it turned out, to anyone patient enough to find another way to the same information. The humans had broadcast the signature. The Xylos ships had done exactly what they were designed to do when they detected it. The Empire had defeated itself, with great efficiency, using technology it had built and documented and never thought to question, because it had never seriously considered that anyone would study it from the outside with the intention of understanding it better than its creators did. Saren heard herself ask if that meant the humans had never had a weapon at all. Alara said not in the sense the Empire had been looking for. What they had was time, and the particular quality of attention that comes from knowing you are smaller than the thing you are studying, and that being wrong carries serious consequences. Every assumption the Empire operated on, that its technology was beyond analysis, that its enemies would respond to displays of force in predictable ways, that primitive meant incapable of careful thought. Those assumptions had done more damage to the Xylos military than any weapon could have. The humans had not fought the armadas. They had waited for the armadas to fight themselves, and they had been very, very patient about it. Alara looked out the window at the city below for a moment before continuing. The hiding was finished, she said. 40 years in the dark had been enough. There were species in this galaxy worth knowing, worth trading with, worth the complicated and uncertain work of building something across the distances between stars. Humanity was ready for that now, in a way it had not been when the Xylos first sent their scout fleet to a blue-green planet at the edge of known space. The galaxy would know them, she said. All of them. Openly, and without apology, and starting now. The amphitheater had been constructed over a neutral star specifically for moments like this one, gatherings too large and too fraught for any single species territory, where the implied ownership of a location would have poisoned the conversation before it started. 200 delegations occupied the curved tiers, each positioned according to a seating protocol that had taken longer to negotiate than most of the actual agenda items. The chamber was vast enough that the far side was slightly blurred by atmospheric management systems, and the combined hum of 200 different atmospheric preferences being maintained simultaneously gave the space a low, constant undertone that no one mentioned and everyone noticed. The Xylos delegation sat in a position that communicated, through the precise grammar of ceremonial placement, that something had changed. They occupied their seats with the careful composure of people who had made their peace with a new arrangement and were not going to give anyone the satisfaction of appearing otherwise. Beside them, in a seat so understated it seemed almost accidental, sat Alara. Gray uniform, no insignia, a data slate resting on the desk in front of her, and a cup of tea beside it, steaming gently in the recycled air. The council chairman called the matter to order. The request was straightforward in its language and complicated in its implications: full sovereign recognition, voting rights, formal standing in every body and process that governed how the galaxy's species conducted their shared existence. The objections began before the chairman had finished speaking. Dozens of delegations, some with genuine grievances and some with fears dressed up as grievances, each finding their own way to the same essential argument. 300,000 ships. Unknown weapons. A species that had appeared from a classified corner of the registry and dismantled 2 of the largest armadas ever assembled without taking a single visible casualty. One ambassador rose and pointed across the chamber at Alara with the directness of someone who had decided that diplomatic indirection was not serving the moment. "Conquerors," he said, "a threat to every species in this room." Alara waited until he had finished. Then she stood, and the room became quiet in the way rooms do when something is about to be said that will be repeated afterward. She said the ships had not been destroyed. Every crew member who had ever been taken from a vessel had been returned, fed and treated and delivered home. She said the humans had asked for one thing across the entire span of the conflict: to be left alone, and had been refused that request twice by a force of 300,000 ships sent to their home system without warning. She said there was a word for responding to that with whatever tools were available, and the word was not conquest. The word was survival. Then she sat down and picked up her tea, and the chamber remained quiet for a moment longer than chambers usually do after someone has finished speaking. 3 days was a long time to listen to people be afraid of you, but Alara had done longer. She sat through every session, took notes in the precise shorthand she had developed over years of meetings where the official record and the actual conversation were 2 different things, and drank tea that the amphitheater's service staff had learned to bring at regular intervals without being asked. She did not interrupt. She did not react visibly to characterizations that were inaccurate or arguments that were made in bad faith. She gave every speaker the full weight of her attention, which was its own kind of response, and she waited. On the 3rd day, the chairman asked if humanity had anything further to add before the vote. Alara stood and said she would like to share a story, which was not what anyone had been expecting. The story was about a bird. It lived on Earth, she said, and it could not fly, had lost that capability so long ago that the biological memory of flight had faded from its lineage entirely. It was small at the beginning, she said, and slow, and every predator on the continent treated it as available. It survived anyway, across millions of years, through the unglamorous method of being very good at not being found. Then something arrived that could find anything, and hiding stopped being sufficient, and the bird faced the kind of moment that either ends a species or changes it fundamentally. It chose to change. Over generations it grew large and fast, and equipped with feet that could open a predator from throat to stomach with a single kick. The cassowary, she said, for anyone who wanted to look it up afterward. No predator on Earth hunted it anymore. Not because they lacked the instinct, but because the instinct had been educated out of them by enough encounters with the outcome. Humanity, she said, was that bird. It had hidden for as long as hiding worked, and then it had changed, and now it was standing in this chamber asking for a chair at the table it had been excluded from since the first Xylos scout ship filed its low-priority report. They were not predators, she said. They had not come to hunt anything. But they were no longer the thing that other species calculated they could afford to approach without consequence. The vote was called. The numbers came in. Humanity was admitted to the Galactic Council, and Alara sat down and finished her tea. The observation deck was a semicircle of transparent material at the amphitheater's outer edge, positioned so that the neutral star filled the lower half of the view and open space filled the upper half. It was not a place designed for lingering. There were no seats. Nothing to suggest it was meant for anything other than a moment's pause between obligations. But Alara was standing there alone when Saren found her, looking at the stars with the expression of someone whose work is done, and who is not yet sure what to do with their hands. Saren said what seemed appropriate. Humanity had a voice now. Alara nodded without turning, and said that a voice was just sound. What gave it meaning was what you said with it, and whether you kept saying it when it became inconvenient. Saren asked what humanity intended to say. Alara turned then, and there was something in her expression that Saren had not seen there before. Not the careful diplomat's composure that had carried her through 3 days of the council chamber, but something underneath that, older and less managed. She said the galaxy was afraid of humanity because of what they had survived, as though surviving a death world was a threat rather than a fact about what the universe had required of them. But the species that knew suffering most directly were not the ones most likely to want others to experience it. Humanity had known hunger and war, and the specific fear of a species that is not certain it will continue to exist. They did not want to export any of that. They wanted to be the thing that stood between it and the species that had not yet had to face it. The shield, she said, not the sword. Saren had spent most of her life in close company with the idea of humanity, had studied them, feared them, defended them in rooms where defending them was not the safe position, had learned their languages and their music and the particular way their history kept almost ending and then finding a reason not to. She had not expected to feel, at the end of all of that, what she felt standing on the observation deck with the neutral star warming the air around them. Alara's smile, when it finally came, was smaller and more genuine than the ones she had deployed in the council chamber, and it was directed at Saren like something offered rather than performed. The decision moved through the galaxy the way significant decisions do, unevenly, arriving in different places at different times and meaning different things depending on who received it and what they had been expecting. Some species celebrated with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of those who had been hoping for exactly this outcome. Others received it with the careful stillness of civilizations that have learned to wait for the second and third effects of large changes before deciding how to feel about them. A few began quiet military preparations, operating on the assumption that a species this capable, now formally positioned at the center of galactic governance, would eventually behave the way powerful species had always behaved. The humans did nothing that confirmed this. They sent no fleets to newly accessible territories. They made no claims. They issued no statements about spheres of influence or strategic interests, or the natural extension of their position into regions that could benefit from their presence. They opened their borders and they waited, and the waiting was patient in the way that only a species with a long history of patient waiting can sustain. What came through the open borders was everything: researchers and traders, diplomats and artists, species motivated by curiosity, and species motivated by desperation, and species that had simply heard something that sounded interesting and wanted to see for themselves. The humans received all of them. They offered tea, which had by this point become the most recognized symbol of human diplomacy across 600 star systems, and they asked questions and answered questions and shared things they were proud of alongside things they were not. The wars. The centuries of pollution that had required extraordinary effort to partially undo. The ideological hatreds that had burned through generations of their history and left scars still visible in their institutions and their art. They did not present themselves as a species that had arrived at wisdom by an easy path. They presented themselves as a species that had survived a very hard one and found, somewhere along the way, that the survival had clarified certain things. One human, asked by a journalist from a species that had never encountered the concept of an interview why humanity had not used its position to claim territory, gave an answer that was translated into over 400 languages within the decade and appeared, in various forms, on walls and data feeds, and the dedications of books across the galaxy for generations afterward. She said they had looked at the stars for a very long time before they were able to reach them, and what they had seen was not territory waiting to be claimed but homes, each one belonging to someone, each one containing everything that mattered to the people living on it. Earth had almost been destroyed once by the species that lived on it. They understood, therefore, in a way that required no philosophy and no argument, exactly what it would mean to do that to someone else. Somewhere in the dark at the edge of human space, the Ghost Fleet received a signal. The Sentinels had been running their patrol routes for over a century, through 2 wars and a diplomatic revolution, and the slow transformation of the species. They had been built to protect from something hiding in the dark into something standing in the light. The signal was simple and had never been sent before. It told them they could stop. One by one, across the vast perimeter they had maintained without acknowledgement or ceremony, the Sentinels powered down and went still, and the dark at the edge of human space became, for the first time, just the dark. The house was small by any standard, which was exactly what Saren had wanted. A single story, a garden that she tended with more enthusiasm than skill, windows on 3 sides that let in the particular quality of late afternoon light that the Xylos' home world produced in the season between the 2 long winters. She could see the stars from the back garden on clear nights, which was most nights, and she had a chair positioned specifically for that purpose that had developed, over 5 years of regular use, a comfortable depression that fit her exactly. Alara visited when she could, which was not as often as either of them would have liked, but more often than the distance between their respective responsibilities should have made possible. She brought tea, which she prepared herself rather than leaving to anyone else, and human books in physical form, a detail Saren had mentioned appreciating once, and that Alara had filed away and acted on without discussion. The collection had grown to fill 2 shelves. The mythology volume was the one Saren returned to most often. She had raised this with Alara one evening while the garden was cooling around them, and the first stars were becoming visible at the edges of the sky. What struck her, she said, was not the content of the stories but their orientation. Xylos' mythology was built around compliance, heroes who succeeded by understanding the proper order of things and operating within it. Human mythology went the other direction entirely. Gods defied other gods. Mortals defied gods. Children defied parents, and were sometimes right to. The entire tradition seemed organized around the premise that the established arrangement of things was a starting point for argument rather than a final condition. Alara laughed in the way she laughed when something pleased her without surprising her. She said it was an accurate description. Humanity had spent most of its history in opposition to something, geography, disease, the people in the next valley, its own worst instincts, the vacuum of space. They had developed a relationship with the word impossible that was less acceptance and more negotiation. Saren asked if that ever ended, if there was a point at which there was nothing left to push against. Alara was quiet long enough that the question had space to breathe before she answered. There was always something, she said. The list changed, but it never emptied. Disease and ignorance, and the specific loneliness of being a thinking creature in a very large universe. Humanity would keep at it until they won or until they didn't, and either way they would not have stopped voluntarily. Saren sat with that and found that she had, after all these years, finally arrived at an understanding of what humanity actually was. Not warriors, not conquerors, not the galaxy's most dangerous species, though they were certainly that. They were the ones who looked at a thing that could not be done and began working out where to start. The integration was not seamless, because nothing involving that many species and that much history ever is, but it moved in a direction that was generally forward and occasionally surprising. Humanity did not seek territory. They sought, as far as anyone could determine, everything else, knowledge and connection, and the specific satisfaction of a problem solved that had previously seemed permanent. On a dozen worlds that had suffered various combinations of infrastructure collapse, environmental damage, and institutional failure, Human teams appeared with equipment and questions, and the characteristic willingness to stay until the work was done rather than until the scheduled departure. Gardens went in alongside hospitals. Libraries were built in places that had not had them in generations. Music showed up, which other species had not predicted and found difficult to categorize but generally did not object to. Tourists began arriving on Earth in numbers that required the construction of dedicated facilities, and the facilities were built and staffed with the same straightforward hospitality that seemed to be the default human setting in the presence of a guest. The visitors came expecting to observe something, and left having experienced several things they had not planned for. The gravity was higher than their bodies were accustomed to. The atmosphere was more reactive. The wildlife had not been fully informed that the planet now hosted guests from other civilizations, and behaved accordingly. And the humans, the actual humans, encountered in their natural context rather than in diplomatic settings, turned out to be doing things that required extended explanation. A report circulated among xenobiologists from a species with a conservative approach to physical risk, describing their observations of a human recreational activity that involved ascending very large geological formations for no material benefit. When asked to explain, the human they interviewed had thought about it briefly, and then said that it was beautiful up there and that they only had one life and intended to use it to see as much as possible. The report noted this answer without being able to fully account for it. It was distributed widely and contributed to a significant revision of several species models for predicting human behavior. Saren read it in her garden on a cool evening and smiled at the stars. She had spent decades trying to explain humanity to people who did not want to be explained to, and here was the galaxy, finally, doing its own explaining. The Deathworlders had become teachers without intending to, which was, she thought, exactly how the best teaching usually happened. The neutral world chosen for the centenary ceremony was one that had no particular history with either humanity or the Xylos Empire, selected specifically because neutrality was what the occasion required, a space that belonged to the moment rather than to any of the stories contained within it. The amphitheater was open to the sky, and the sky was clear, and the delegations that filled it represented every recognized species in the Galactic Council plus several that had only recently achieved that recognition, some of them through processes that humanity had facilitated. The Xylos delegation was smaller than it had once been and seated in the middle tiers, rather than the elevated positions the Empire had previously occupied, which said something true about how the last 100 years had redistributed things without anyone having to say it aloud. Saren's daughter led them, carrying herself with the particular composure of someone who grew up watching a parent navigate difficult rooms and absorbed the method without being taught it explicitly. Elara arrived with her tea, which had long since ceased to be a diplomatic statement and become simply a thing she did. Her hair had gone fully gray over the last decade, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned to be precise rather than fast, and she greeted the other delegations with the same quality of attention she had always given everyone, which was the kind that made people feel their presence had been genuinely registered. The format was simple. Each delegation shared a story, not summaries of policy changes or trade agreements or the formal record of how the relationship had developed across a century, stories, specific ones, about particular moments and particular people. A human physician who had arrived on a damaged station with equipment and no common language, and had found ways to communicate what was needed anyway, and stayed until every patient was stable. A human engineer who had rebuilt a school on a world that had not had functional education infrastructure in a generation, and who had taught the local teachers how to maintain what she had built before she left, so that her leaving did not undo what her arrival had made possible. A human musician who had sat with an elder of a species whose entire musical tradition had been lost in a conflict, and had spent 3 months helping reconstruct it from fragments and memory. Saren's daughter spoke last, which was not the position she had been assigned, but the one she had been given when the delegation that preceded her finished, and the chairman looked across the chamber, and she was already standing. She spoke about her mother, about a life spent studying a species everyone else had dismissed, defending them in rooms where defending them cost something, learning their languages and their music out of genuine love for what she was learning rather than any practical benefit it provided. The strongest beings in the universe, she said, were not the ones with the largest arsenals or the longest histories or the most accumulated power. They were the ones who had been given every reason to become cruel, by circumstance and pain and the long instruction of a hard world, and had looked at all of that and chosen something else. The chamber was quiet when she finished. Alara, seated in the middle of the Xylos tier, pressed 2 fingers briefly against the corner of her eye and did not apologize for it. The garden was at the ceremony's eastern edge, separated from the main amphitheater by a low wall and a line of something that grew in spirals and smelled faintly of mineral water. Alara found it after the formal proceedings ended, when the chamber had dissolved into the kind of gathering that follows ceremonies, groups reforming, conversations beginning, the careful post-event navigation of a few hundred diplomats finding their way back to informality. She slipped through the gap in the wall and found a bench and sat down and looked at the sky, which was doing what skies do when you finally have time to look at them. She thought about the first armada in the way you think about something that happened a long time ago, not with the sharp immediacy of memory, but with the softer quality of a story you know well. 10,000 ships coming to a blue-green planet that had not asked for their attention. The people who had built the Ghost Sentinels, who had done it quietly and without recognition, and had then sat in the dark for decades waiting to find out whether the thing they built would be needed, hoping it would not and knowing it might. All those patient years. She thought about Saren, which she did often. The office in the Imperial Palace with the 2 shelves of human books. The garden at the edge of the home world where the stars were visible. The chair with the comfortable depression. 5 years was not a long time in galactic terms, and it was a long time in the terms that actually mattered, which were the ones measured in conversations and evenings, and the small accumulated weight of someone's presence over years, until you could not quite separate your own thinking from the way they would have responded to it. She had seen a child at the ceremony, standing near the delegation from a cephalopod species whose members moved with the boneless, flowing ease of creatures that had evolved in deep water. The child had bright eyes and the kind of skinned knees that come from outdoor activity pursued with more enthusiasm than caution. She had looked at the nearest ambassador for a long moment and then asked, with the directness that children deploy when they have not yet learned that directness requires permission, whether she could touch his tentacles. The ambassador had extended one with the particular gentle formality of someone genuinely charmed. The child had touched it carefully, and then looked up with the expression of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis and is already forming the next one. That child would not grow up knowing the dark as a thing to be afraid of. She would not understand, except as history, what it had meant to be a species hiding behind a wall of silent sentinels, hoping the wall was enough. The work of 100 years had purchased something that could not be measured in ships or treaties or the formal record of diplomatic achievements. It had purchased the conditions under which a child could be curious about a stranger's tentacles, and the stranger could be charmed by the question. Alara finished her tea and sat for another moment with the stars and the spiral plants and the distant sound of 400 species finding things to say to each other. Then she walked back through the gap in the wall toward the light. Above her, somewhere beyond the atmosphere and the slow ceremonial orbit of the station that had hosted this gathering, the ghost sentinels drifted in their final silence, decommissioned, purposeless, no longer needed. They had done what they were built to do. The species they had protected had grown into something that did not need protecting anymore, or rather had grown into something that had learned to protect others, which was the better outcome, and the one that nobody who built them had quite allowed themselves to hope for. It was by any measure that counted, the greatest thing humanity had ever done. Not the sentinels, not the disabled armadas, not the seat at the galactic table. This, the curious child, the extended tentacle, the world made safe enough for the question to be asked. This was what it had all been for.